Woman insults fellow passenger in first class, instantly regrets it. The opulent terminal of the Horizon International Airport's elite lounge gleamed under the soft glow of chandelier lights, mirroring the sparkle of the diamond-encrusted bracelet on Charlotte Whitmore's wrist. Adjusting the folds of her designer silk scarf with polished fingers, she caught a glimpse of her flawless reflection in the marble floor. At 45, Charlotte had perfected the art of elegance. From her meticulously styled ash blonde hair to her tailored crimson blazer, everything about her exuded wealth, power, and refinement. Ms. Whitmore, a young lounge attendant, addressed her with a deferential nod. "Your flight to New York is now ready for priority boarding." Charlotte didn't bother responding with words. She rose gracefully from her leather armchair, leaving behind a half-empty flute of vintage champagne. Her Prisme carry-on rolled noiselessly as she made her way to the private boarding bridge. It was separated from the main terminal, ensuring she wouldn't have to mingle with the economy-class passengers she found utterly intolerable. The first-class cabin of Flight SA-901 welcomed her with its signature aroma of leather upholstery and fresh orchids. Charlotte had flown this route countless times, but this particular journey felt special. The upcoming trip was set to finalize her company's largest acquisition yet, a $300 million deal that would secure her position as one of New York's most formidable business leaders. "Seat 1A, window side, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her smile impeccable. Charlotte settled into the plush seat, immediately pressing the call button. "I'll have a glass of your finest champagne before takeoff," she requested, not bothering to look up from her phone. She was typing a message to her assistant about a crucial meeting when something caught her eye, a shadow moving into her peripheral vision. A man was settling into the seat beside her, and Charlotte immediately felt her chest tighten. Something about him seemed terribly out of place. He wore faded jeans. Jeans, in first class, paired with a plain gray t-shirt that had seen better days. His scuffed brown leather laptop bag looked like it had survived years of neglect, and his casual sneakers bore visible signs of wear. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with unruly dark hair that seemed unfamiliar with a professional barber and the faint stubble of someone who hadn't shaved that morning. Charlotte stared in thinly veiled disbelief as he stowed his battered laptop bag in the overhead bin and slid into his seat, utterly unbothered. Surely, this was a mistake. Perhaps an economy passenger had accidentally wandered into the wrong section. Or worse, the airline had granted some undeserved upgrade to a frequent flyer. "Excuse me," Charlotte called sharply to a passing flight attendant whose name tag read Amelia. "There seems to be some confusion. I believe this gentleman is lost and should be in the economy cabin." The man paused mid-motion, glancing up briefly at Charlotte. His dark eyes carried an unsettling calmness, as though her words didn't faze him in the slightest. Instead, he returned to scrolling through his phone, ignoring her entirely. Amelia smiled politely as she examined the man's boarding pass. "Everything appears to be in order, Miss Whitmore. Mr. Harper is correctly seated in 1B. "That's impossible," Charlotte declared, her voice louder than she intended, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Look at him. He clearly doesn't belong here." She lowered her voice to a stage whisper, which was easily overheard. "Did he use miles or something? Or is this one of those charity upgrade programs?" The man, Ethan Harper, apparently, calmly pulled a MacBook from his bag. Its surface was covered with stickers from tech conferences and startups, further solidifying Charlotte's assumption. He had to be some mid-level IT worker who had stumbled into an upgrade by sheer luck. "I paid for my ticket, ma'am," Ethan replied, his voice calm but with a quiet authority that she found irritating. "Well, that's precisely my point," Charlotte said, her tone dripping with condescension. "First class on this airline costs thousands of dollars. Surely someone with your—" She trailed off, her gaze deliberately scanning his attire. "Modest means would feel more comfortable in economy. Among your peers." Across the aisle, a distinguished-looking older gentleman in an impeccable navy suit cleared his throat. Charlotte recognized him instantly. Richard Bennett, CEO of a prominent investment firm. She had seen his face on magazine covers and had been hoping to use this flight as an opportunity to network with him. Now, this scene was unraveling her carefully constructed plans. "I assure you, I'm perfectly comfortable here, Ethan replied, opening his laptop and beginning to type as though her words meant nothing to him. Charlotte flushed with indignation. How dare he dismiss her so casually? She pressed the call button again, summoning the chief purser, an elegant woman in her 50s named Margaret. Is there a problem, Miss Whitmore? Margaret asked, though her knowing gaze suggested she had already observed the entire exchange. There most certainly is, Charlotte said, her voice tight. This man, this Ethan Harper, clearly doesn't belong here. I pay a premium to avoid situations like this. Surely there must be another seat available? Margaret's professional mask didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. Disapproval, perhaps. I apologize, Miss Whitmore, but first class is fully booked today. I assure you, all passengers are seated according to their tickets. Ethan hadn't stopped typing throughout the exchange, but Charlotte noticed his fingers had paused momentarily. His laptop screen displayed complex financial projections and an email draft addressed to someone with a corporate domain she didn't recognize. The exchange ended with Margaret walking away, leaving Charlotte simmering with indignation. As the plane began to fill with the final passengers, she felt her carefully curated world of perfection start to tilt, just slightly, out of control. Little did she know, this man she had dismissed so easily would soon shatter her entire perception of status, wealth, and what it truly means to belong. Charlotte adjusted her posture, sitting straighter in her seat. I pay a significant premium to fly first class, she declared, her tone icy. Specifically to avoid situations like this. Surely there must be another seat available, perhaps one next to someone more. She glanced meaningfully at Richard Bennett, seated across the aisle. Suitable. Margaret, the chief purser, maintained her professional composure, though a flicker of something, perhaps disapproval, glinted in her eyes. I apologize, Miss Whitmore, but the first-class cabin is fully booked today. I can assure you that all passengers have been seated according to their tickets. Ethan Harper hadn't looked up once during the entire exchange. He continued typing on his laptop, but Charlotte noticed his fingers had paused briefly. Her sharp gaze landed on his screen, which displayed what appeared to be complex financial models and an email draft addressed to a corporate domain she didn't recognize. As the final boarding call echoed through the cabin, Charlotte fished her phone out of her designer handbag, her fingers flying across the screen. She discreetly snapped a photo of Ethan, captioning it with the words, "Can you believe they're letting people like this into first class now? Standards have really slipped. Considering alternative airlines for my next flight." She hit send, a small sense of satisfaction momentarily easing her irritation. Little did Charlotte know, her meticulously curated world of privilege and superiority was about to be completely turned upside down. The quiet man in jeans beside her would soon become the catalyst for a humbling experience she'd never forget. The gentle hum of the aircraft at cruising altitude did little to calm Charlotte's growing frustration. She spent the first 30 minutes of the flight pointedly scrolling through her social media feed, tilting her phone screen just enough for her seatmate to see photos of her recent yacht party in Santorini and her sprawling villa on the Amalfi Coast. She was certain the display of her luxurious lifestyle would remind him just how out of his league he was. Ethan, however, seemed entirely uninterested. He remained focused on his work, occasionally making quiet phone calls using his earbuds. Despite his efforts to keep his voice low, fragments of his conversation caught Charlotte's attention. "Yes, the merger looks promising," Ethan said. "No, I want to retain the current staff. Their expertise is invaluable." He paused, listening intently before adding, "I understand the board's concerns, but maintaining company culture is more important than immediate profit margins." Charlotte rolled her eyes dramatically. Clearly, he was trying to sound important. He was probably some mid-level manager pretending to wield authority. She'd encountered enough corporate wannabes to recognize the type. A flight attendant arrived to distribute lunch menus, addressing Ethan first. "Would you like to see the wine pairing suggestions with your meal, sir?" Before Ethan could respond, Charlotte interjected with a sharp laugh. "Oh, don't bother with the wine list. I'm sure he'd be more comfortable with whatever beer you have available," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Turning toward the others, she added in a conspiratorial tone, "Some people just aren't used to distinguishing between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy, you know." An awkward silence followed, broken only by a few uncomfortable coughs. Across the aisle, Richard Bennett briefly glanced up from his documents, his disapproval clear. Ethan, however, didn't appear fazed. He smiled at the flight attendant. "The 2010 Chateau Margaux will do nicely, thank you." His calm confidence, and his ability to order one of the most expensive wines on the menu without hesitation, only added fuel to Charlotte's irritation. "How amusing," she said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "I once had an assistant try to impress clients like that. He ordered a pricey wine thinking it would make him seem sophisticated. Bless his heart, he didn't even know how to hold the glass properly. We had to let him go, of course. In our world, appearances matter." Ethan took a sip of water, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "In what world would that be, Miss Whitmore?" Charlotte's smile widened, though her tone dripped with condescension. "The real world of business, darling, where deals are made by people who understand the value of presentation, not by—" She gestured vaguely toward his casual attire, assistants playing dress-up in first class. Across the aisle, a young woman who had been pretending to read winced visibly at Charlotte's words. "I see," Ethan replied, closing his laptop. "So in your world, deals are all about appearance rather than substance?" "Oh, you wouldn't understand," Charlotte said with a dismissive wave. "When you're handling multi-million-dollar negotiations like I do, every detail matters. The right clothes, the right connections." She pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photo of herself surrounded by prominent business figures. Holding it up, she added, "This was taken at last month's Global Economic Forum. I doubt you'd recognize anyone in the photo, but in my circles, these are the people who matter." Ethan leaned over slightly, studying the image with genuine interest. "Interesting. The gentleman on the left, isn't that Marcus Tan? I heard his company has been facing some significant challenges lately." Charlotte's confident smirk faltered for a moment. She hadn't expected him to recognize anyone in the photo, let alone know insider information about Marcus's company. The details of those challenges hadn't even been made public yet. Recovering quickly, she shifted her attention to Richard Bennett. Raising her voice, she called across the aisle. "Richard, darling, I've been meaning to discuss the Everside acquisition with you. I heard your firm is handling the financing." She emphasized his first name, hoping to establish herself as his peer. Richard looked up from his iPad, his tone polite but distant. "I don't discuss ongoing deals during flights, Ms. Whitmore," he said, notably refraining from using her first name in return. Of course," Charlotte replied with a forced laugh. "We'll save it for the New York office." She paused, as if remembering something. "I'm having dinner with the board next week anyway." The comment was entirely fabricated, but Charlotte hoped it would reinforce her image of importance, especially in front of Ethan, who had returned to typing on his laptop with maddening indifference. Her carefully laid plans for the flight were crumbling, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Ethan Harper was more than he appeared. And soon, the full weight of his identity would come crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Charlotte leaned toward Richard Bennett, emphasizing his first name to establish a false sense of camaraderie. "Richard, I've been meaning to ask you about the Bradshaw acquisition. I heard your firm is handling the financing," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be overheard by nearby passengers. Richard glanced up, his expression neutral. "I don't discuss ongoing deals during flights, Miss Whitmore," he replied politely but firmly, notably refraining from using her first name. Of course," Charlotte said, laughing awkwardly to mask her discomfort. "We'll save it for when we're back in New York. I'm having dinner with the board next week anyway." This was an outright lie, but she delivered it with enough confidence to make it seem believable. Her goal was to reinforce her own importance, especially in front of Ethan, whose casual demeanor continued to vex her. "How fascinating," Ethan commented, his tone light but genuine. "You must have an interesting perspective on the current market fluctuations." Charlotte straightened up, preparing to regurgitate phrases she'd picked up from financial news. However, her attempt at a response was interrupted by a commotion several rows ahead. A flight attendant had tripped, sending a glass of red wine tumbling to the floor. Without hesitation, Ethan stood, offering his napkin and helping the attendant regain her composure. He asked if she was all right with such quiet sincerity that the flustered crew member seemed genuinely comforted. His simple act of kindness, performed without any expectation of recognition, was a sharp contrast to Charlotte's behavior throughout the flight. As Ethan returned to his seat, Charlotte stared at him with barely concealed disdain. "Playing the hero for the staff," she said, her voice laced with mockery. "How predictable. You know, people like you should really understand their place. There's a natural order to things. Those who serve and those who lead. I think we both know which category you fall into." The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet. Some passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to hear, while others openly turned to watch the exchange. Charlotte, however, was too engrossed in her own perceived superiority to notice the shifting atmosphere. She examined her manicured nails as if bored. "Tell me," she continued, "which small company do you work for? One of those local startups trying to make it big? Or perhaps a niche firm dabbling in tech?" Before Ethan could respond, a flight attendant approached their row, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that suggested something significant was about to happen. A subtle smirk played at the corners of Ethan's mouth, hinting that Charlotte's assumptions were about to unravel. After what Charlotte deemed a sufficient display of her superiority over her seatmate, she turned her full attention back to Richard Bennett. He had removed his suit jacket, revealing a custom-made shirt with subtle gold cufflinks, the type of detail Charlotte instinctively noticed in potential business associates. "You simply must tell me about your recent expansion into Asian markets," she called across the aisle, her voice deliberately louder than necessary. "I heard your quarterly projections exceeded expectations." Richard looked up from his tablet, his tone polite but distant. "You seem well informed about our operations, Miss Whitmore." "Oh, please, call me Charlotte," she said, shifting her posture to fully face him and practically turning her back on Ethan. "I make it my business to stay updated on industry leaders. In fact, I'm hosting an exclusive dinner next month for select CEOs and venture capitalists. You should join us." Ethan continued writing in a leather-bound journal, the scratching of his pen seemingly grating on Charlotte's nerves. She shot him an annoyed glance, but pressed on with her networking attempt. "The guest list is quite impressive," she boasted. "Andrew Chang from Global Innovations will be there, along with Natalie Silverstone from Beacon Ventures." She dropped the names with calculated precision, watching Richard for any sign of recognition. A flight attendant arrived with hot towels. When she offered one to Ethan, Charlotte couldn't resist another dig. "Oh, he probably isn't used to such luxuries," she quipped, loud enough for others to hear. "In economy, they just use regular napkins, don't they?" She laughed at her own joke, glancing around for approval that never came. Richard accepted his hot towel with a slight frown. "I found that competence and character rarely correlate with familiarity with luxury amenities," he said, his tone carrying a pointed edge. "Richard, darling, you're far too diplomatic," Charlotte replied, waving dismissively. "Success leaves clues, as they say. Those who belong in these circles understand the importance of maintaining certain standards." She gestured toward her perfectly tailored outfit, as if it were proof of her argument. The lunch service began, and Charlotte seized another opportunity to showcase her sophistication. As the flight attendant presented the appetizer options, she made a show of discussing wine pairings and her dietary preferences. "I simply can't imagine eating anything less than perfectly prepared," she announced to no one in particular. "My personal chef always says presentation is everything." Ethan quietly accepted his meal with a simple, "thank you," which Charlotte found utterly uninspiring. "Richard," she called out again, "you must try the caviar. Though I'm sure it's nothing compared to what they serve on your private jet," she added, pausing meaningfully for effect. The cabin seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, but Charlotte remained oblivious. The stage she had set for herself was about to collapse in the most spectacular fashion, but she was still blissfully unaware. "You do have one, don't you?" Charlotte asked Richard Bennett, referring to a private jet. "I've been thinking of adding one to my fleet," she added with a smug smile. Richard's smile tightened. Actually, I prefer commercial first class. Better for the environment. How charmingly conscious of you, Charlotte replied, though her tone made it clear she found his statement anything but admirable. Of course, some of us can't afford to prioritize the environment over efficiency when handling deals worth hundreds of millions. She let the comment hang in the air, the implication of her own importance unmistakable. Ethan made a quiet sound, perhaps a suppressed laugh, that made Charlotte bristle. Something amusing? She asked coldly. Not at all, Ethan replied mildly, his tone polite but with an edge that made her cheeks flush. Charlotte turned back to Richard with renewed determination. As I was saying, she continued, when you operate at our level, certain luxuries become necessities. Just last week, I had to send my assistant in my helicopter to close a deal in Geneva because the commercial flights were fully booked. The story was a complete fabrication, but Charlotte had long believed that perception was reality. She saw Richard glance toward Ethan's laptop, his expression shifting slightly. He sat up straighter in his seat, his attention no longer fully on her. Misinterpreting this, Charlotte pressed on. Of course, I prefer to handle the major negotiations myself. She said confidently, as I always tell my board, leadership is something you can't delegate. She reached into her handbag and pulled out an elegant leather business card holder. We should discuss potential synergies between our companies, Richard. I'm sure there's room for mutually beneficial collaboration. Richard, however, was now glancing between Ethan and his laptop screen with an expression Charlotte couldn't quite decipher. Frustrated by his divided attention, she sweetened her tone. Perhaps we could continue this conversation over dinner in New York. I have a standing reservation at Le Grand, a very exclusive spot. They only serve people of a certain caliber. She cast a pointed look at Ethan's casual attire. At that moment, a flight attendant returned to their row, addressing Ethan directly. Her demeanor was noticeably different, deferential and almost nervous. Mr. Harper, the captain wanted to know if you'd like to visit the cockpit during the flight. He said it would be an honor. Charlotte froze mid-sentence, her social smile faltering. Something about the way the flight attendant had addressed Ethan, Mr. Harper, triggered a faint memory. A news article she'd skimmed? A business profile she'd seen somewhere? She couldn't quite place it, but an uneasy feeling began to creep over her. Before she could process this further, Richard leaned forward, his tone suddenly warm and animated. Ethan, I didn't realize it was you. I've been meaning to discuss your recent acquisition of the European routes. Brilliant strategy, absolutely brilliant. Charlotte's carefully curated composure cracked. The pieces began falling into place, but she desperately tried to maintain her poise. Surely this couldn't be. The flight attendant was still standing nearby, holding out a tablet displaying what appeared to be a flight manifest. And there, listed as a VIP passenger, was a name that made Charlotte's stomach drop. Ethan Harper, CEO and majority shareholder of the airline they were flying on. The expensive wine in Charlotte's glass suddenly tasted bitter. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted palpably as realization spread among the passengers. Ethan Harper, the man Charlotte had spent hours belittling, wasn't just wealthy. He was an aviation titan, a visionary leader who had revolutionized luxury air travel across 3 continents. Your integration of AI for predictive maintenance has changed the game, Richard continued, now fully engaged. I don't think any other airline has matched your safety record since implementing it. Ethan smiled modestly. The credit goes to our engineering team. They're the real innovators. Charlotte sat frozen, her mind racing through every condescending comment she'd made. The wine jokes, the barbs about his clothes, the assumptions about his status. Each memory now felt like a dagger to her ego. Mr. Harper, Margaret, the chief purser, approached with a leather portfolio. We have the quarterly service reports you requested, as well as your usual selection of international newspapers. Thanks, Margaret, Ethan said warmly, his tone a stark contrast to Charlotte's dismissive attitude toward the crew. How's Anna's college application going? Did she hear back from Harvard yet? Margaret beamed. She got in. Your recommendation letter made all the difference. Charlotte's head spun. Not only did Ethan know his staff by name, but he was casually dropping references to Ivy League recommendation letters. Around her, other passengers began whispering, their gazes flickering between Charlotte and Ethan. A young woman 2 rows ahead turned around excitedly. "Mr. Harper, your speech at the Global Aviation Summit about sustainable air travel was so inspiring. My firm has been studying your carbon reduction initiatives." "That's kind of you to say," Ethan replied, his humility disarming. "I hope you've also looked at our commitment to maintaining full employment during the transition. Technology should enhance jobs, not replace them." Richard nodded approvingly. "That's what sets you apart, Ethan. Most companies would have used automation as an excuse for layoffs. You've actually increased hiring." The cabin buzzed with admiration and respect for the man Charlotte had dismissed as an unworthy interloper. Meanwhile, she could feel the weight of every eye on her. Her carefully constructed facade of superiority had crumbled in spectacular fashion. Margaret returned with a secure satellite phone, addressing Ethan once more. "Mr. Harper, the Tokyo headquarters team is on the line. They need guidance on the new Trans-Pacific route planning." "Thanks, Margaret." Ethan took the call, switching seamlessly into fluent Japanese. Charlotte stared in stunned silence. He wasn't just wealthy or influential. He was brilliant, multilingual, and respected across the industry, and she had spent the entire flight making a fool of herself. As the realization fully sank in, Charlotte felt physically ill. The man she'd tried to humiliate was not only the owner of the airline, but also a leader who embodied everything she had pretended to represent: substance, innovation, and true class. Ethan replied, "I hope you also noticed our commitment to maintaining full employment during the transition. Technology should enhance jobs, not replace them." Richard nodded approvingly. "That's what sets you apart, Ethan. Most other companies would have used the automation upgrades as an excuse for layoffs, but you actually increased hiring." The cabin had subtly transformed into an impromptu business networking hub. The very type of interaction Charlotte had desperately tried to manufacture was now happening naturally and effortlessly around the man she had dismissed as an unworthy outsider. Another flight attendant approached Ethan with a tablet. "Mr. Harper, here are the updated Singapore operations reports. A 40% increase in premium bookings since the new terminal design was implemented. They're requesting approval to move forward with the next expansion phase." Ethan scanned the data quickly and gave a decisive response. "Tell them to proceed, but remind them to maintain sustainability standards and prioritize upgrades to staff facilities before anything else in the public spaces." Charlotte felt a wave of nausea. She had spent the entire flight boasting about her imaginary private jet, only to discover she was seated next to a man who owned an entire fleet of aircraft. The revelations didn't stop there. A distinguished older man in the front row turned to face Ethan. "Ethan, my boy, I didn't realize you were on this flight. How's the hospital wing coming along? The one you're funding in memory of your mother?" "Breaking ground next month, Senator," Ethan replied warmly. "We're focusing on advanced pediatric care. My mother would have loved that." Charlotte could hardly breathe. Not only was Ethan a wildly successful CEO, but he was also a philanthropist with connections in the highest circles of influence. Her earlier remarks about people who matter now echoed in her mind, growing more mortifying by the second. Richard, now fully engrossed in conversation with Ethan, leaned in. "I have to say, your decision to wear casual clothes during flights is genius. It's the perfect way to evaluate the passenger experience firsthand. I read about it in your Bloomberg interview." Charlotte's head snapped toward Ethan, her mind racing. His casual appearance, which she had so smugly mocked, wasn't a sign of ignorance or poverty. It was an intentional choice by a CEO who prioritized substance over flash. "My father taught me that," Ethan explained with a modest shrug. "He always said that true leadership is about understanding every aspect of your business, not just the boardroom view." Richard nodded, clearly impressed. "Speaking of boardrooms, I still can't get over how you handled that hostile takeover attempt last year. Turning those corporate raiders into long-term investors, incredible work." Ethan smiled faintly. "It wasn't complicated. I showed them our employee satisfaction metrics and retention rates. Happy workers mean happy customers. That's all there is to it." As if on cue, another flight attendant approached with a secure satellite phone. "Mr. Harper, the Tokyo team is on the line. They're requesting your input on the Trans-Pacific route planning. Ethan took the call, switching effortlessly into fluent Japanese. Charlotte's chest tightened as she caught fragments of the conversation, her disbelief mounting. He wasn't just a CEO, he was multilingual, commanding respect across continents. Around her, other passengers were now shooting her amused or pitying looks, a stark contrast to the silent disapproval earlier. The young professionals who had witnessed her earlier arrogance exchanged knowing glances, while some openly smirked. Her carefully curated image of superiority had not only crumbled but was being publicly dismantled, piece by piece. Charlotte's phone was still open to the photo she had snapped of Ethan earlier, the one she had intended to mockingly send to her assistant. She stared at it again, seeing it now with entirely different eyes. The casual attire she had judged so harshly was no longer a mark of inadequacy, but of confidence. Confidence so complete it needed no external validation. The most devastating revelation, however, wasn't just about Ethan's wealth or status. It was the undeniable truth that, while Charlotte had spent the entire flight trying to prove her own importance, Ethan had been quietly running an airline, solving real problems and making million-dollar decisions, all without feeling the need to broadcast it. As the full weight of her mistakes pressed down on her, Charlotte realized this wasn't just a social misstep. It was a potentially career-ending humiliation. In trying to prove that she belonged in first class, she had inadvertently demonstrated exactly why she didn't. The hours ahead promised to be the longest of her life, and judging by the glances and whispered conversations around her, her humiliation was far from over. Ethan finished his call in Japanese and set the phone aside. Charlotte's throat felt like sandpaper, but she knew she had to say something. Her professional reputation, and what was left of her dignity, hung by a thread. "Mr. Harper," she began, her voice uncharacteristically unsteady. "I feel absolutely mortified about my earlier behavior. If I had known that I own the airline?" Ethan interjected smoothly, his voice calm but sharp. "Would that have made my humanity more valuable to you?" "Would it have made my humanity more valuable to you?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. The question hung in the air like a dagger. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one looked away. This was proving to be far better than any in-flight entertainment. Charlotte stammered, her usual polished demeanor cracking. No, of course not," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "I simply meant, that is, I was having a stressful day, and I didn't mean to suggest you should be relegated to economy class or to mock the concept of social mobility." Ethan's questions, posed with such disarming gentleness, stung even more than outright accusations. Charlotte's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, her confidence unraveling. "I realize now how awful I must have sounded. I'm not usually like this, I assure you. In fact, my company has a very robust diversity and inclusion program." "Which you personally oversee, I'm sure," Ethan commented. His tone was mild, but the faintest smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, drawing a barely suppressed snort from Richard Bennett. Desperate to salvage something, anything, Charlotte pulled out her business card with shaking fingers. "Perhaps we could discuss potential partnerships," she offered, her voice faltering. "My company is looking to expand its corporate travel arrangements." Ethan glanced at the card but made no move to take it. "Interesting," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Would these arrangements include special treatment for executives while your junior staff flies economy? Based on your earlier comments about the natural order, I'd be curious about your company's hierarchical structure." The color drained from Charlotte's face. He was quoting her own words back to her, and every syllable hit with precision. Around her, passengers who had witnessed her earlier behavior were now watching the scene with undisguised satisfaction. "Mr. Harper, please." Charlotte lowered her voice to a whisper, her desperation evident. "My company's annual travel budget is over $10 million. Surely we can move past this. Unfortunate misunderstanding." "Unfortunate misunderstanding?" A new voice joined the conversation. It was Margaret, the head purser, who had returned with a stack of documents for Ethan. "Would that be the same kind of misunderstanding that led you to file 3 complaints about economy passengers wandering into first class last month?" Charlotte's eyes widened in horror. They had records of her behavior. Ethan signed the documents Margaret handed him, then turned to Charlotte, meeting her gaze for the first time since his identity had been revealed. "Money doesn't define class, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice steady and measured. "Actions do. Your travel budget could be 10 million or 1 million, but if you treat people as inherently inferior based on their perceived economic status, you'll never truly belong in any class." Before Charlotte could respond, a younger flight attendant approached Margaret with a tablet displaying what appeared to be a passenger manifest. She whispered something, and Margaret nodded gravely before turning back to Charlotte. "Ms. Whitmore," Margaret began, her professional detachment unwavering. "It appears we have a situation with our seating arrangements. We need to make some immediate adjustments." Charlotte clutched the armrests of her seat, her voice barely a whisper. "What kind of adjustments?" Margaret's smile didn't waver. "Given recent events and passenger comfort concerns, we'll need to reseat some of our guests. Protocol regarding disruptive passengers is quite clear." "Disruptive?" Charlotte's voice rose an octave. "I was simply making conversation." "Making conversation?" Richard interjected, his tone sharp. "You spent hours attempting to humiliate someone you deemed beneath you, and then tried to network your way out of the consequences when you realized your error. I've witnessed enough toxic corporate behavior to recognize it instantly." Charlotte's carefully constructed world was crumbling. Her meticulously planned facade of poise and control was slipping away as she turned to Ethan, her voice now trembling with desperation. "Mr. Harper, surely we can discuss this reasonably. I admit I made some regrettable comments, but surely it doesn't warrant. I don't get involved in the crew's decisions about passenger comfort and safety," Ethan replied, his voice calm and unwavering. "They're highly trained professionals who don't need the owner second-guessing their judgment. Unlike some, I trust my employees to do their jobs without constant reminders of hierarchical status." Margaret consulted the tablet again. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her tone professional but firm, "we'll need you to gather your belongings. We've arranged alternative seating for the remainder of the flight." "Alternative seating?" Charlotte's voice was barely audible now. "You don't mean—" "Yes," Margaret said with a professional smile. "We have a middle seat available in row 47. Unless, of course, you'd prefer we make an unscheduled landing to remove you from the flight entirely." The first-class passengers were now openly watching the unfolding drama. Charlotte could hear whispers and see phones discreetly raised to capture her humiliation. By the next day, she would likely be trending on social media as the embodiment of entitled behavior meeting poetic justice. "This is outrageous," she tried one last time, though her voice lacked conviction. "Do you even know who I am?" "Yes," Ethan replied quietly, his words like a hammer striking the final nail. "You've spent the last few hours making sure everyone knows exactly who you are. That's precisely the problem." Margaret stood waiting patiently, while another flight attendant had already begun gathering Charlotte's designer carry-on items. Her walk of shame began. As she passed Richard, he didn't even glance up from his discussion with Ethan. As she moved down the aisle, passengers in business and economy stared, some smirking, others whispering. A few discreetly recorded her, their faces a mixture of amusement and judgment. Just before reaching her new seat, Charlotte glanced back one last time. Ethan had already returned to his work, calmly discussing sustainability initiatives with Richard as though nothing had happened. Her humiliation was complete, and the reality of her mistakes hit her with crushing clarity. In trying to prove she belonged in first class, she had shown exactly why she didn't. As Charlotte's designer carry-on items were gathered by a flight attendant, she rose on unsteady legs. The murmurs around her were impossible to ignore. "Karma is real. Did you record that? My whole office needs to see this." "Best flight ever." Her walk of shame began. She passed Richard Bennett, now fully engrossed in a lively conversation with Ethan about sustainable aviation fuel innovations. She walked past the rows of young professionals who had witnessed her arrogance earlier and now exchanged knowing smirks. As she moved through the business-class cabin, she could already tell news of her humiliation had spread like wildfire. Before being led into economy, Charlotte glanced back one last time. Ethan was seated calmly in his first-class seat, reviewing documents on hospital wings and educational programs, projects that were actively changing lives, while she had spent the flight boasting about imaginary helicopter rides. The last thing she heard before being shown to her middle seat was Margaret's voice. "Mr. Harper, would you like us to arrange a more comfortable seating arrangement for you?" "No need," Ethan replied. "I'm perfectly comfortable where I am. Though," he added with a faint smile, "perhaps we could send some complimentary champagne to row 47. Miss Whitmore seems to be quite the expert on wine pairings." Quiet laughter rippled through the cabin, and Charlotte's cheeks burned as she sank into her new seat. The humiliation would haunt her dreams for months to come. The remainder of the flight felt like an endless fever dream. Wedged between a sleeping teenager and a chatty grandmother, Charlotte spent the 8 hours in economy, replaying every mortifying moment. The whispers, the stares, the suppressed laughter. They were all etched into her memory. Even the drink cart seemed to pass her by, with the crew offering her nothing more than perfunctory glances. As the plane began its descent into New York, something unexpected happened. A flight attendant approached her row and handed her a sealed envelope. "For Mr. Harper," she said simply. Charlotte's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, half expecting a lifetime ban from the airline. Instead, she found a handwritten note on corporate letterhead. "Ms. Whitmore, true success isn't measured by how we treat people who can benefit us, but by how we treat those we think can't. I'm writing to offer you an unusual opportunity. Our airline runs a mentorship program for underprivileged youth interested in aviation and business. We could use someone with your business acumen if you're willing to learn as much as you teach. Sometimes the best view isn't from first class, but from helping others get there. If you're interested, Margaret has the details. Ethan Harper." Charlotte read the note 3 times, her vision blurring with unexpected tears. Instead of crushing her career, Ethan was offering her a chance at redemption, and more importantly, growth. When the plane landed and passengers began disembarking, Charlotte remained in her seat, letting others go ahead, a small but significant departure from her usual rush to be first. When she finally exited the aircraft, Margaret was waiting at the terminal with a business card. "The program runs every Saturday," Margaret explained, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "We work with teenagers from challenging backgrounds, teaching them about business, aviation, and most importantly, dignity and success." Charlotte swallowed hard. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why offer this to me after how I behaved?" Margaret smiled gently. "Because 8 years ago, I was one of those teenagers. Mr. Harper found me working 3 jobs to support my sick mother. Now, I'm head purser and completing my MBA. He believes everyone deserves a second chance to rewrite their story." Charlotte nodded, her throat too tight to respond. As she walked through the terminal, she saw Ethan ahead, helping an elderly passenger with her bags. He was still in his casual clothes, still uninterested in broadcasting his importance. Beside him, Richard was deep in conversation about creating opportunities for underprivileged youth in the aviation industry. 2 weeks later, Charlotte stood nervously in a community center in Brooklyn, far from the corporate boardrooms she was used to. Gone were the designer labels and airs of superiority. She wore simple business casual attire as she faced a room of eager teenage faces. "I'm here to teach you about business," she began, her voice steady. "But first, I need to tell you about the most important lesson I ever learned, from a man in jeans and a t-shirt who happened to own an airline." Over the following months, Charlotte's story of humility became a cornerstone of her teaching. As she guided young people in navigating the world of business, something remarkable happened. She herself transformed. Freed from the shackles of arrogance, her expertise became a genuine force for good. One Saturday, 6 months into the program, Charlotte was surprised to see Ethan sitting quietly at the back of her class. He watched as she helped a young girl perfect her business pitch, a girl who, months earlier, had been too shy to even speak up. After the session, Ethan approached her. "That was impressive," he said. "You've changed lives here." Charlotte smiled, a warmth in her expression that was entirely genuine. "I had to lose my first-class seat to find my true class," she replied. Ethan nodded toward the group of students who were still buzzing with excitement over their projects. Next month, we're flying these kids to our engineering facility in Singapore. They'll see firsthand how an airline operates. Would you help coordinate the trip? Economy class, of course, Charlotte said with a small laugh. I wouldn't have it any other way. As she watched Ethan leave, still dressed casually, still prioritizing impact over appearance, Charlotte realized that true elevation had nothing to do with cabin class. Her social media, once filled with images of yachts and villas, now featured her students' success stories, their small victories, their growing confidence. A year after that fateful flight, Charlotte found herself back in first class. This time, she was accompanying two of her students who had won aviation scholarships. As she helped them navigate the menu and explained the wine pairings, she caught Margaret's approving smile. "Champagne, Miss Whitmore?" Margaret asked. "Perhaps later," Charlotte replied. "Right now, I'm teaching my students something more important than wine pairings. I'm teaching them that class isn't about where you sit, it's about how you treat others along the journey." As the plane soared into the sunset, Charlotte smiled, knowing that sometimes the most important upgrades in life have nothing to do with where you're seated, including your own. Ethan said with a small nod, glancing toward the group of students who were still animatedly discussing their projects. Charlotte smiled, a genuine warmth replacing the practiced social facade she had relied on for years. "I had to lose my first-class seat to find my true class," she said softly. "Thank you for seeing potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself." Ethan gave a knowing smile, then gestured toward the students. "Next month, we're flying these kids to our engineering facility in Singapore. They'll get to see firsthand how an airline operates. Would you help coordinate the trip?" "Economy class, of course," Charlotte replied with a small laugh. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As she watched Ethan leave, still dressed in his casual clothes, still more focused on impact than image, Charlotte understood something profound. True elevation had nothing to do with which cabin you were seated in. Her social media these days looked very different from what it once had. Gone were the photos of yachts and extravagant parties. In their place were snapshots of her students' successes, small victories, growing confidence, and life-changing moments. The following week, an unexpected email landed in Charlotte's inbox. Due to her dedication to the mentorship program, she was being offered a position as Director of Community Engagement for the airline's educational initiatives. Though the salary was less than her previous corporate role, the opportunity to create meaningful change made it priceless. A year to the day after that fateful flight, Charlotte found herself back in first class. This time, she wasn't traveling alone. Two of her students, winners of prestigious aviation scholarships, sat beside her, wide-eyed with excitement. As she helped them navigate the menu and explain the wine pairings, Charlotte noticed Margaret nearby, offering her an approving smile. "Champagne, Miss Whitmore?" Margaret asked. "Perhaps later," Charlotte replied with a smile. "Right now, I'm teaching my students something more important than wine pairings." She glanced at her students, who were marveling at the experience. "I'm teaching them that class isn't about where you sit, it's about how you treat others along the way." As the plane took off into the golden sunset, Charlotte leaned back in her seat, reflecting on how far she had come. She finally understood that life's most important upgrades had nothing to do with status or wealth. True luxury, she realized, was the privilege of helping others rise.